a subcommittee work session for House Bill 264. I call to order. The piece of information we circulated is for some background information as to what is gone on in the United States as far as current status of similar bills and similar actions. So I wanted to make sure you had a copy of that information, just to get us all up to speed.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
So, Madam Chair, if I may,
Yes.
I understand that this is dealing more with the process than the approval. In other words, it's dealing with how you get to modify the birth certificate, not trying to say we can do it.
That's correct. Currently, individuals can get their birth record changed. It requires them to go to court, have the same medical information, the same document that a physician would sign, but to also set up a court date and speak to a judge who'd make a decision as whether or not to change it. I have found out from some transgender people who have gone to court, and some of the justices in New Hampshire essentially rubber stamp their request. They don't ask any questions. They comes across the desk and it has a form from a physician, and they just stamp it and send it along, which surprised me, because in the past I have heard of a number of physicians that require in-depth information, and sometimes the presence of the signing physician.
That seems to be a very high burden to make the physician have to come to court.
Yes, as well as costly, because the applicant also has to pay for the physician's time. I was also, although I changed my information in Massachusetts, my physician had to sign my form that I brought down there and notarize it. The physician charged me for their time to go get the documents notarized. So it was $70 for their time.
That's an interesting comment, because if I understand what you said and how this applies here, the governing body over the birth record is predicated upon where the birth occurred. What I'm trying to get to, if I was born in New Hampshire and I'm in California now, I have to go by the regulations of New Hampshire because that's where my birth record is. However, if I'm in New Hampshire as a resident today and I was born in California, I'm subjected to the rules in California, not New Hampshire. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Because I was asked to add something to this bill to allow people from out of state to change their birth record in another state, and in investigating that would have been an illegal activity. If I just focused at essentially the process that we currently have in place and how could we improve it for one time for individuals to change their information, which is similar to all of our surrounding states and to many that are listed on the summary that we've got. It would just be one step. The second time anyone wants to change the information, they would have to go and discuss this with a justice in the court system.
Can I ask a question of where birth certificates are required and for what purposes? If you know that. The background on that sort of is I actually have an LSR in around suspended licenses, because driver's licenses were initially intended just for driving, but they've turned into a de facto form of identification. So that means that if somebody surrenders their license after a suspension, they have to get a non-driver's ID. But then that has implications if they move out of state, because then they're not flagged as a driver. And there's so many other consequences of using a government document beyond what it was initially intended for. That I think we find ourselves trying to deal with that creep. We have our social security numbers that were intended just for making sure that we were able to track our contributions, but now they're essentially our ID number. Our driver's licenses are our main form of identification. And it seems like our birth certificates, that should be a historic document of how we were at birth, now are being used in so many other ways that it seems like kind of a creep of documents being used for more than they probably should be.
Thank you for that question. As I found out, well, when I got my birth certificate changed, I brought that information to the Social Security office. They didn't require the birth certificate. What they required was the court-issued document with my name change. And that's proved valuable because the IRS tracks that information and does take a look at the individual's name as recorded with their Social Security number.
Okay.
On the passports, you need to provide, initially you need to provide a birth certificate, and you can self-identify what your gender is. So whatever information is changed on a birth certificate, and a birth certificate at the time it is changed currently, if you have a court document that says this is my name change, as well as the document that the physician says identifies your gender, you can get all of that information changed at one time. So if they have just the document from the physician that says there's a gender change, but there's no name change, the name stays the same, but the gender can change. So when I went to get my birth record changed, I had the court-ordered name change document at the same time. So both were changed at one time.
Thank you. That's incredibly helpful. I know that's sort of a scope, another scope creep when you're using the passport for internal documentation, but that one is based on your identity and who you are and how you identify.
Right.
And I think that actually is a great way to be able to show who you are now, who you have become, and who you are going forward.
That's correct. And in my case, everything was changed on the same date. And in Newton, Massachusetts, my original birth record still exists, and it identifies that it was changed there, and the document that was issued in Massachusetts didn't include any information about my name change or birth record information changed on the document they issued.
Okay. And sorry, as a clarification, that was the new document that you received from Massachusetts with your new updated birth certificate.
That's correct.
Didn't annotate that there had been a change.
That's correct.
Okay.
Right now, here in New Hampshire, if someone goes through the process of getting a court-ordered court-ordered modification of their birth record, if they update that along with the name the same time, there is no marginal note. If they do it separately, there is a marginal note about their name change.
Okay, thank you. That's absolutely helpful.
Yeah.
But looking through this, if I read it correctly, and I'm always subject to reading things incorrectly, if I look at the original birth certificate, it does get retained. The original birth certificate is retained by the city clerk.
The original birth record is retained by our vital records office.
Vital records.
Vital records.
But by the state of New Hampshire, not the
Right.
city clerk.
Right.
Okay.
They don't keep those records local to the town. It's all in the vital records office.
But the original is always available.
The original will still be maintained.
It's never lost. Okay.
That's correct.
Thank you. I think my My main opposition to this is that it's a birth record and not a now record. The idea of having a passport be a now record is one of those wonderful things where it can show who you are now, but our birth certificates are listed as birth certificates. Do you know if there's I don't think that there's a process so that if there's a baby and biologically the father is gone from possibly that first night of conception or day of conception or later on, and then there's a father who has stepped in and truly is the one who lives as the father and is the one who has raised them possibly from birth or before. There's no way to change a birth record to update that. That would simply be adopting them, even though their true lived reality is that that other man is the one who truly is their father as opposed to simply the donor.
That's understood, but the, that person would still be listed as an adopted parent.
Okay.
So following on that logic, if a mother at the time of birth on the birth record does not identify a father, so it's going to come across as only the recognition of the mother, but no father. But subsequent to that, if the father decides to step forward and take responsibility, can they go back and modify the birth record to include the father's name on the record?
And with that, is that done through genetic testing or just an attestation that they are in fact the father? Do you know?
I don't know. I don't think we do
Okay.
genetic testing now for the father
Our-
to begin with. So
Well, paternity tests we do.
Paternity
I think
research.
we have some information from research.
Get a maternity test, and some of it's rolled into like child support, but across the country, there are specific, in statute or in admin rules that allow a correction from birth certificate for paternity, either to be removed if they find that that's not the case, or to add. And some places will require a court order, and some require proof, but it's on the state.
So that sort of, I think, helps me understand it. What I'm trying to get to is the birth record at the time of birth is not cast in stone. It could actually be modified for different reasons.
Depends on the state.
Depends on the state.
And then as clarification, but it may be updated, but it is for what is true at the time of birth. That because you're establishing them through a paternity test. Was that a correct understanding that there's a paternity test in most places that do this?
Yes.
Okay.
In some cases are open-ended and some are new. The most new cases in what we're hearing in the medical field confidentially. And then amended, they have procedures in administrative rule where we will just make enough remarks about it, talk it out, somewhere like that, and specific to that particular state. But there are some states that won't make it.
Okay.
Which I'm gonna go get if you want to look at the particular state, I did administrative rules and RSA's.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm not trying to be argumentative or diminish the experience of anybody that's going through it. It's just looking at it, reading through this. I was thinking about how important it is to make sure that people aren't having to present a document that's traumatic to them. And to make sure that they're able to show who they are as they are living. But the idea of a birth certificate, when it's not the conditions that were at birth, is one of those things that feels like it's a changing of language because it's not a living certificate. It is a birth certificate. So philosophically, I have that issue.
Yeah.
And I hear what you're saying about it being living versus, again, something that's cast in stone. And that's what I'm trying to get to with the researcher. It sounds like it is a living document because you can go back and make changes to that document. If you can make changes to the document, therefore it becomes, in my opinion, a living document. And that's what I'm trying to get to with the father. If the father is going to be changed and we allow for that to happen, then we do allow for the modification. If we do allow for modifications to the record, in essence, it becomes a living document.
And thank you for that. But if that is based on genetics and genetic proof that they are the genetic father, that updating it to reflect the genetic conditions at the time, I think is different than being able to reflect that person that adopted them even as a 3-month-old fetus.
I don't disagree. I think the argument I'm trying to make is that if we allow for any modification to a document, it becomes a living document.
And I think that's probably more of a point of disagreement there, but we know how to disagree in a friendly way. So that's good. That's one of the things I like about this committee and like about you in particular.
And I will say the same to Representative Leon. I do enjoy the ability to have a hearty, healthy discussion and at the same time still go out and have lunch.
Absolutely.
I think the scope of what this bill says is whatever the current situation is listed on the birth certificate as far as parents go, that's what's used. If that information changes on the original birth certificate, or even whatever's in place, the original as well as current would be listed on that document as of any changes, because that would be the information required. But if it's been changed, it's sort of a succession of things if it's been changed. And then, like say, the real father is added. That would be an additional piece that's available for information, but the gender information would have changed in the time period.
Thank you. Do you know how intersex births are handled it seems like, from what I understand, it seems like a best guess, which really, really, really is harmful to intersex individuals.
The way I understand it is that an intersex child, when they're born, there is a notation made on that record that still needs to be determined. And I think there's a few months time. I'm not sure if it's not years, if I understand that correctly. And part of that is to allow some development time to figure out whether one gender is specific or not. And that is a challenge for intersex people as they grow up, as their bodies may change. However, I know intersex people who would like to get their gender changed and will have to do something similar in this process to get that changed. And this would actually help them in that process, because they can get a statement from the physician that says this is the gender they identify as.
Madam Chair, if I may, to the researcher, when I see under type of process, it says administrative court ordered, but it also talks about type of certificate. It says amended, new. Can you help me understand what's the difference between amended and new?
Completely make you a new one, with whatever changes that. If it's amended, they might just draw a line through the old one or put a notation in the side saying this was changed to X, Y, Z. So you would see that there was a change on the amended one, but they won't give you a new one.
Thank you. So if I understand that what this bill does, is it still remain amended, or are you looking to make it a new? Because this issue of the process to get there, but at the end of the process, are we looking for a new certificate or an amended certificate?
It's issued as a new certificate.
Okay.
But the original is noted that it has been amended.
Correct. Because I think one of the things during the testimony was the fact that in the state of New Hampshire, the process itself is somewhat flawed. It's a process of where do you get the form, who has the form, where do you go to vital records. So that's dealing with the process itself. So that's what this bill's trying to clarify, or to make more easily understood, and the process itself to be easier. But at the end of the journey, we're still going to have a new certificate versus amended one. So I'll break it apart into two parts. One's the process.
The visible document you're handed currently is you have a new
New
document.
document.
There's no notations.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And looking at the New Hampshire information from the 50 states comparison, there's 6 months for changes or corrections to the birth record without approval of the registrar using a form. So while 6 months will give some time for parents of intersex children to help figure out so that they're not just randomly assigning a gender at birth, I definitely understand that process can be longer and ongoing. I've had the pleasure of knowing a few intersex individuals in my life, and the ones I've known are wonderful, wonderful, unique people that are dealing with a path that not many of us have to walk.
That's correct. This bill does not address non-binary people. A bill was introduced. I introduced a bill over 4 years ago that was passed in the House and Senate and went to the governor's desk. And he did not, he vetoed it, primarily because it included non-binary. There are more states now that have included that, but we still have the same governor. And I know that we have a number of transgender people that don't identify as non-binary, and this would be important to that group of people. So I brought it forward as you see today. Now, if the classification of non-binary is something we need to consider for the future, that's the future. I believe that there's only 13 states that currently issue a non-binary identification.
So I do want to say, Madam Chair, that the way that you wrote this and the way that you addressed it is a very clear and elegant way to deal with some of that uncertainty over how the court process is handled. And the idea of having the court order for return is sort of a disincentive for anybody who wants to be a bad actor, because they exist amongst every group of people. If you find me a group of people that doesn't have bad actors in it, I will be amazed.
Yes.
So I just want to say that's not about any particular group, other than the fact that we're all humans.
And that is why I decided it was best when we wrote this up that it did require any additional changes would require approval from a legislative official. Court.
I mean, I guess the way that I stand on this is that if you believe that birth records are something that doesn't reflect birth, but reflects who you are now, that this is a very good way to go about it. But I would like to see a return to birth records being about birth and separating out our now records into a different category and classification. And for that reason, I'm not going to be able to support the bill, just because I think that we should get back to more clarity on what document does what, not because of any intent to deny people the ability to truly be who they are, but simply because I think that I just need to stick to that foundational principle.
Understood. I can appreciate your concern there.
Madam Chair, if I may?
Yeah.
If we go back to, first of all, I want to say this isn't quite the research. I want to commend the researcher for all the work that's put into this. If you go back and look on page 34 of what she provided, and if you look on page 34, you'll see in the left-hand column, New Hampshire. And if you go down to V5, it does, in fact, allow for a new birth certificate. So the end result is not going to change. It's just the process we're going to use to get there.
Thank you. I recognize
So I
that.
hear your foundational principle. I don't disagree with you. But I think that issue has been dealt with here in the statute. So therefore, the statute currently allows for that fundamental or foundational document to be changed. All we're talking about here is the process to get there.
Thank you. And I also want to thank the researcher for the amazingly thorough job of doing this. This is phenomenal. I recognize that that's the way that our laws are currently.
Okay.
I would actually, if we can figure out a process, I'd love to figure out how we can point more things to a now record when you're trying to identify how a person is and how they are to be treated today, as opposed to the birth record. And I'd support any efforts to do that. I just don't want to move along a process when I think that we need to move away from birth records as anything other than a record of birth.
Understood.
So, and I appreciate all the work that's gone into this. I expect that I'll be in the minority with this position, but it's one of those where I want to just hold true to what a document is and just stop the scope creep. Let's reflect who we are with something other than a birth certificate and make it so adults aren't really handing in birth certificates willy-nilly, because we know you're here. We know you exist. And we know that who you are today may be very, very different than how you started off. And that we need to respect and appreciate those individuals. And that we need to do that in a way where we're not tying it to a historic type document.
Thank you. I believe some of what society has changed in the mechanisms that we use information. It's probably why organizations don't require a birth certificate. For instance, our DMV does not require a birth record, and the getting a passport now does not require a birth record, especially to change things. You can, in both those situations, you can self-attest as to what is your gender. You don't have to have a document from a physician. So,
Well, thank you. And with that, I think that it's important to have the birth records to be able to establish citizenship, because there's a difference between citizenship and not. But beyond documenting that you as an individual were in fact born in the United States for the purpose of citizenship, I don't really see much value in the birth certificate going forward other than establishing that citizenship.
correct. I agree.
It's interesting you talk about a living document versus a non-living document. I'm trying to go through and identify any document out there that is truly not a living document in some capacity.
I'd say a death certificate's not, I'm not making a play on words there, but once it's been ruled by the medical examiner how you died, it I believe is almost impossible without significant evidence to change it.
But it can be changed. And sometimes it comes down to the medical examiner will put down the cause of death and then later on change it based upon the other evidence and change the reason for the death. So I'm trying to get to is every document we have in some capacity has the flexibility to change that document somewhere along its journey.
Thank you. And with that, with those changes, you're better reflecting the conditions upon that time of death, as opposed to any subsequent events. Just as our laws allow for a name change for those who are living, but other than an infant who dies very, very soon, it doesn't allow for any of those changes for somebody who is now deceased. Because once you're deceased, it pretty much puts a stop on that. And as a birth record, if we can close that window to say that the birth is pretty much for the fact that you were born here, and beyond that, we need to look to other documents to show who you are today.
Correct.
However, if you go back and look at page 34, in the first 6 months, you can change the birth record without any court order, without any. So we do allow for a record to be modified within that first 6 months. So therefore, if it can be modified in 6 months, that's my argument.
And you're very, very wonderful at mincing words and finding specific avenues. And I appreciate that very, very much. I think that flexibility is very necessary, because otherwise, if you had no opportunity to change that, you'd have parents coerced into immediate surgery on their babies when they're born intersex. And the idea of pressuring a parent into making that decision immediately before they get to know their child, get to know the process, understand the consequences of those choices, I think would be far more harmful than holding that window open for 6 months, especially because our birth record process is one that is undergoing some improvements, because our birth worksheet has some that needs to be attested to under penalty of law, because that's what goes into the birth record, and then others that are quite intrusive, that perhaps you shouldn't be held to answering those truthfully under the threat of law, when they're social questions and personal questions that have no bearing on the legal status of your child.
However, when you look at that 6 months, back to the original comment I made earlier about the father, it does allow for the mother or the father to step forward without a paternity test to be added to that birth record. It does allow for incorrections on that birth record from being one gender versus the other gender, which is a mistake, to correct the mistakes. So it's not just the unisex, it's a question of that time. The record itself is not something at the time of birth cast in stone.
Thank you. Then I guess perhaps we shouldn't call it a birth certificate. We should call a 4th and 5th trimester certificate. I love getting into these points with you, Representative Merchant. I absolutely do. But I think that as far as this goes, I agree that if this is a process we want to proceed in, this is a very well-written bill. But I'm just sticking to my philosophic point that about the birth records.
Okay, very good. And
Time's lunch.
any additional comments?
No, I want to say that I totally understand Representative Leon and the issue that she raises and her philosophical beliefs. We are definitely on different sides of the belief on that part of it, but I do understand where you're coming from. I have a lot of respect for where you're coming from. And at this point in time, which you said before, is what the statute is today is what it is. And if I understood correctly, is that the way the statute is today, you'd like to see a fundamental change in the statute itself, which is not what we're going to today.
To clarify that, I think I guess if you're talking about the living document versus a record of the birth or the first 6 months of life, that would be a fundamental difference. I think that any changes to the law would have to come long after the birth certificate no longer is used for any of these procedures. That needs to be a shift that happens culturally, and that needs to happen by recognizing other documents and letting the law reference other documents as opposed to the birth certificate when you're trying to establish the condition of the person now and their true identity now. And until that happens, there's absolutely no reason to do any sort of harm to anybody on changing what these birth certificates are. Even if in the future there's some idea that all we're doing is a simple snapshot at birth, that would be starting at that point as far as I'm concerned. And we have a lot of societal shifts that need to happen to recognize that people's true lived reality can be very different from how they were born, before we can get to changing any of those details. And I think that as society shifts that way to recognize that, it almost becomes irrelevant around that part of the birth certificate. Because if we are no longer using a birth certificate to prove who we are when we're 43 or 57 or 89 or even 18, that it no longer carries that consequence. And it would be a very, very different document.
Yes.
So do we have a birth record and a birth certificate?
I think we just need to move away from the birth certificate as a form of identification for anything other than citizenship.
I concur.
I think we're discussing something that probably goes much further than what's being proposed.
This is mental gymnastics between myself and Representative Leon.
Probably a societal change in how we view things and what's required. And I think some of that is occurring now with where legal organizations are not requiring the same thing that we required 20 years ago.
Madam Chair, I'll make a motion to approve the bill as written and recommendation to the committee to be ought to pass as written.
Thank you. I guess I will second that.
Correct. You can second that as the chair.
Yes. And would like, I guess I'm looking for a vote from both of you.
My vote is to vote in the affirmative.
Okay.
My vote is to vote in the negative simply because I think that we should move towards the separate recognition of who you are. Sorry, it's not supposed to be discussion and voting mode. I apologize, Madam Chair.
Okay. And my vote will be in the positive to bring this forward
So we have
as for
2
a
to
not
1.
pass vote.
That's a 2 to 1 vote.
2 to 1. 2 to 1 vote. Yes, to be recorded.
That sounds wonderful. Where should we go to lunch?
So with that, I will call this meeting closed.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.